The lights were already burning hot when Luther stepped into the wings. From the crowd, all they could see was a silhouette. A broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, mic in hand, ready to make thousands of strangers feel like the only person in the room. But backstage, it was quiet, too quiet. He adjusted his cufflinks twice, then a third time. A small ritual to steady his breathing, to keep the other rhythm inside him from breaking through the rhythm of questions he had never been allowed to ask out loud. By the time the world started calling him a legend, Luther Vandross had already learned one brutal rule of show business, especially for a black man with a voice like velvet. On stage, you belong to everyone. Off stage, you belong to no one. The cameras never saw the small details. The neatly pressed towels lined up in the dressing room. The untouched room service trays. The diet book stacked next to song lyrics. The phone on the table that almost never rang for anything but business. To the public, he was the king of love songs. The man who made anniversaries sweeter, weddings more romantic, breakups more bearable. Couples danced to his voice. Babies were conceived to his records. Lonely people fell asleep with his songs looping through cheap headphones. But for Luther himself, love was something else entirely. It was a locked file. A document marked private in a world that loved prying eyes. In the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds, the rules were simple and merciless. Black male artists were expected to be strong, desirable, untouchable. The magazines wanted confident smiles, not complicated truths. Record labels could tolerate a lot, late arrivals, bad habits, even quiet scandals. But they did not want to gamble with anything that might scare away suburban record buyers or Sunday church fans. So Luther did what many others did. He split himself in two. There was Luther on stage, eyes closed, hand over his heart, begging for any love, promising never too much, wrapping the audience in romance, so convincing that even he almost believed it. And then there was the other Luther, the one who went home to an apartment that echoed when the door shut, the one who kept his phone on silent at night, not because it rang too much, but because it didn't ring at all, the one who, according to people close to him, never talked openly about who he loved, only about the cost of loving the wrong person at the wrong time. Some friends later said that Luther had a way of speaking about heartbreak without naming names. He would talk about promises that disappear when the lights come on, about men who were braver in the dark than in the daylight. He never pointed fingers. He never said who, but his eyes did something his voice never did. They went completely flat, like a tape that had been recorded over too many times. In an industry obsessed with image, his body became another battlefield. There were jokes about his weight on late-night TV. Whispers in label offices about how he should look on album covers. Headlines that cared far more about his size than his sound. He lost pounds. He gained them back. He starved for control in a life where everything, including his own story, seemed to belong to someone else. Behind the scenes, people in the business said there was always a tension around him. On one side, executives, managers, publicists, people who needed Luther to be the perfect product. The voice you could sell to radio, TV, advertisers, award shows. On the other side, private moments, short-lived connections, half-finished conversations with men who either couldn't stay or wouldn't dare to. If you listened closely, you could hear it in the songs. The way his voice lingered on the words, "Any love a little too long." The quiet ache when he sang about someone who never comes home, someone who never fully arrives. It was as if every ballad was a coded report from a war he could never admit he was fighting. Years later, some people claimed that in his final seasons, when the tours were smaller and the nights quieter, Luther began to keep a different kind of list. It wasn't a set list. It wasn't a chart of radio spins or award nominations. They said it was a private inventory of disappointments. People who had stepped close when the rooms were dark, and then stepped back when the world turned its head. Moments when kindness was mistaken for weakness. Deals where love and power got tangled up until no one could tell them apart. No one has ever produced that list. No document has surfaced. Maybe it never existed. Maybe it lived only in his memory, in the pauses between phrases, in the way he sometimes looked down at the floor before singing a line about trust. What we do know is this: In a business built on applause, Luther was a man haunted by silence. Silence from the people who could have stood beside him and didn't. Silence from an industry that loved his voice but was terrified of his truth. Silence from a culture that demanded its black male icons be strong, straight, unbreakable, even if it meant breaking them in secret. One evening, late in his life, after a long day of rehearsals and medical tests, a nurse reportedly heard him murmur something under his breath while the monitors beeped steadily in the background. It wasn't a lyric. It wasn't a joke. "Everybody got what they wanted," he whispered. "Except me." Was he talking about the record labels that made millions off his pain? The audiences who took comfort from songs that cost him everything? The people named or unnamed who moved through his life like ghosts, leaving behind only questions and unsent messages? We may never know for sure. But if there really was a list hidden somewhere in his mind, a quiet roll call of betrayals and vanished loyalties, one question still hangs in the air, like the last note of a love song fading into darkness. In the end, who hurt Luther Vandross more? The men who walked away in private, or the system that made them all too afraid to stay? If the rumors were true, the list didn't start with the biggest name. It started with the first cut. Some people claim that when Luther thought back over the men who had walked into his life and then walked away, the very first name on that private roll call wasn't the most powerful, the most famous, or the richest. It was simply the first man who turned something tender into something to laugh at. He wasn't a giant of soul. He wasn't a legend. He was a flash of color in the mid-80 seconds, a young black pop singer who danced his way through television screens in tight jackets and shimmering hair, all smiles and sparkle. His hit single, a sugary anthem about innocence and self-control, played on every radio station for a season. Parents liked it. Teenagers memorized it. He became, for a brief moment, the poster boy for clean fun. On stage, he looked untouchable. All glitter, all confidence. But behind the scenes, according to people who worked the same circuits, his life was messier. There were whispers about late-night parties, sudden mood swings, pills passed in dressing rooms, and constant fear of falling back into obscurity. He had tasted fame once and was terrified of watching it slip away. He and Luther crossed paths on a summer tour that stitched together a handful of major cities and a lot of sleepless nights. Luther was at his peak, then voice flawless, suits custom-made, his name printed in heavy ink at the top of the posters. The younger singer's name appeared lower down, smaller font, wedged between opening acts and local guests. That didn't matter the first night they met. Backstage, away from the blinding front-of-house lights, the air was thick with sweat, perfume, and the faint buzz of amplifiers cooling down. Technicians hauled cables. Stagehands shouted cues. Somewhere in the chaos, Luther caught the younger man's eye. It wasn't dramatic. No movie slow motion. Just a glance that lingered half a second too long, a shy smile that didn't quite match the loud, flirtatious persona he showed on stage. Later, in a cramped backstage lounge, someone said they saw the younger singer sitting on the arm of Luther's chair, laughing at a joke no one else heard. According to one person who toured with them, the night ended in a quiet hotel room far above the city, where the carpets were thick enough to swallow footsteps and the curtains were heavy enough to keep the morning out. There were no cameras, no contracts, no grand promises. Just two men, tired from the road, sharing the kind of intimacy that only exists when both people agree, without saying a word, to pretend the outside world doesn't exist. For Luther, it was believed to be simple, almost gentle. No declarations, no demands. Just a rare night where he wasn't the headliner, the product, the legend. By the time the sun came up, the city below had already started its day. Room service carts rolled down hallways. Phones rang at front desks. Somewhere in the building, someone knocked on a door that didn't open. 48 hours later, the tone changed. In another city, another theater, the younger singer reportedly began performing a new kind of routine. Not on stage, but in the dressing rooms. It started, people said, as a throwaway line. A joke about scented candles. A casual remark about how some people were too picky about showers, too sensitive about smells, too precious about the lighting. The dancers laughed. The crew laughed. He pushed further. Soon he was imitating a soft, bashful voice, clutching his chest, pretending to be afraid of the dark and the truth. He never said Luther's name, but he didn't have to. In a touring company, secrets are fragile. One wrong word, one wrong laugh, and everyone knows exactly who you're talking about. On a flight between cities, according to a backup singer, the jokes escalated. One of the dancers repeated a twisted version of the younger artist's biggest hit line, turning it into a cheap punchline about taking clothes off and who had, or hadn't, hesitated. The joke traveled up and down the aisle like a paper note passed in a classroom. Luther sat a few rows away, headphones on, eyes shut. From a distance, it looked like he was resting, protecting his voice. Up close, someone later recalled, his jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful, and his fingers dug into the armrest every time laughter broke out behind him. The final blow, as the story goes, didn't happen in a dark hallway or a whispering circle. It happened on live radio. During a local station interview, a host asked the younger singer about recent romantic rumors on tour. There was a pause just long enough for anyone who knew the situation to feel their stomach drop. Then he gave a smooth, rehearsed little smirk and said something cold. "Some people can sing with all their heart," he told the host, "but they don't have the courage to live with it. No names, no specifics." The host laughed. The room laughed. The audience listening at home had no idea who he meant. But everyone on that tour did. That night, Luther went on stage as always. He hit every note, smiled at the right moments, thanked the crowd, held the big ballads until the arena shook. No one in the audience could see him in the minutes between songs, standing in the wings with his back to the wall, staring at the floor as if trying to remember where the line between his music and his life had disappeared. Later, a technician swore they saw him in the dressing room afterward, sitting alone, towel over his head, whispering the same sentence over and over. "I shouldn't have trusted. I shouldn't have opened that door." The younger singer's career didn't explode after that. A few more singles, a few more shows, then the slow fade, smaller venues, cheaper costumes, more desperate attempts to cling to the spotlight. As the years went by, rumors followed him instead of fans. People said he grew thinner, that his skin took on a grayish cast, that he coughed too much and slept too little. Illness came. Then, quietly, the end. No major headlines, no televised tribute, just a small service, a few friends, and some old vinyl records gathering dust in thrift stores, waiting for strangers who would never know the story behind the smile on the cover. Luther did not attend that final goodbye. He sent no flowers, made no statement, wrote no song. To the world, they had never been anything at all. Two names on different posters. Two careers passing in the night. But if that whispered list in Luther's mind truly existed, it was said that this man, this fragile, frightened pop star who turned a private kindness into a public joke, was the first name he could never bring himself to erase. Because some wounds don't come from enemies. They come from the first person who makes you believe you're safe, and then teaches you how wrong you were. If the first man on that invisible list wounded Luther with humiliation, the second one hurt him with something colder. Not laughter, not gossip, just one sentence that erased everything. People close to the business said that if Luther ever spoke about this chapter at all, he didn't mention a name. He spoke in roles. "The kid with the big voice," he would say, "the one I thought I was helping." Before the world knew that young man, Luther knew the sound of his voice in its rawest form, unpolished, powerful, sometimes out of control. It happened in a studio hallway in New York in the mid-1980s, when Luther was already a respected figure, the kind of artist whose opinion could quietly alter the course of a career. In one of the secondary rooms, a 20-something singer was trying to prove himself. His voice was rich but wild, leaping up too fast, pushing too hard, as if he believed that volume could substitute for vulnerability. He was there to audition for something small, a duet project, a trial, nothing that promised longevity. From the next room, behind a glass panel, Luther heard him. According to one engineer, Luther stopped what he was doing. He listened. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing the way they did when he was mentally rearranging a melody. Then he walked into that smaller studio without introduction, without fanfare. The room went silent. The young singer straightened his shoulders, suddenly unsure whether to smile or apologize. Luther didn't scold him. He didn't lecture. He simply looked at the young man and said quietly, "Your voice doesn't need to shout. It needs to be held like a secret." That was the beginning. From that day on, the two were seen together more often, not in front-page spreads or red carpet photos, but in places where cameras rarely reached. Late-night studio sessions where Luther sat in the producer's chair, eyes half closed as he guided the younger singer through line after line, teaching him how to breathe between phrases, how to let a note fall instead of slamming it against the wall. Some nights, staff said, the sessions blurred into something softer. Dinner at Luther's place. Pasta on chipped plates. Records playing low in the background while they argued about arrangements and favorite singers. The industry might have called it mentorship. Others, more cynical, whispered other words. No one could say for sure what label to put on it. But everyone saw this much. The young singer trusted Luther. And Luther, who rarely let anyone past his defenses, let that trust in. Over time, the dynamic settled into something half professional, half personal. The younger man dropped into the studio even when he wasn't scheduled. He lounged on chairs during Luther's own sessions, absorbing tricks about harmonies, phrasing, control. He started calling Luther by a shorter name when no one else was around, a private nickname that never appeared in public. In return, Luther shared things he almost never talked about. Fears about aging in an industry obsessed with youth, frustration with executives who saw him as a voice but never as a full person, the quiet ache of living a life cut into carefully managed pieces. If the first man on the list had been a brief, fragile night, this second one was something else. Time, energy, and care poured into another person like water into dry ground. Then, slowly, the calls changed. The younger singer landed new deals. Bigger stages. He returned to a popular group, his name now printed in bold, surrounded by lights and dancers and screaming fans. At first, he still came by the studio, still fell asleep on couches while Luther worked, still accepted gentle corrections on his technique. But then the excuses began. He was busy. He was on the road. He meant to call. Messages from Luther went unanswered a little longer each week. A demo that Luther had written with his voice in mind, aching, delicate, meant to wrap around that baritone like silk, was sent to him and then quietly returned, untouched, the tape still sealed. That was the first sign. The second came on television. In the early 1990 seconds, the young singer released a project under his own name that vaulted him into a new tier. Critics praised his control. Fans praised his looks. He became a symbol of something the industry adored. The strong, masculine black crooner, capable of making audiences swoon with a single sustained note. Eventually, a talk show invited him on. The cameras were warm and bright. The audience clapped on cue. The host smiled that practiced, curious smile reserved for moments when gossip might be mined. "So," the host asked casually, "a lot of people mention you in the same breath as certain legends. Did anyone in particular shape your sound?" It was the perfect opening. He could have said a dozen names. He could have mentioned the man who had walked into that small studio and offered him direction instead of dismissal. Instead, as some people later recalled, he shrugged. A practiced, easy shrug. "There were singers I admired," he answered, keeping his voice light. "But no one really guided me. I came in knowing who I was. Some older guys were just fans, really people who appreciated what I did. No specific name, no direct arrow. But in that studio where the TV was playing in the background, someone glanced at Luther. They said he didn't move for several seconds. The air seemed to thicken. Just fans. Whatever they had been, teacher and student, brothers, something more, something less. That sentence flattened it into nothing. Not just denied. Rewritten. The man Luther had lifted up, with time, patience, and quiet protection, now stood under the hot lights of mainstream approval and pretended that none of it had ever happened. No late-night sessions, no dinners, no whispered worries in the safety of dim rooms. Just a one-way admiration, like a stranger in the cheap seats gazing up at a stage. After that broadcast, people said the studio phone stayed quiet. No one heard Luther mention the young singer's name again. If a journalist tried to link them, Luther would change the subject. If an assistant played one of the man's songs by accident, Luther would simply say in a calm, almost detached tone, "Skip it." The younger singer's career rolled on. He joined tours, released ballads that made listeners close their eyes and imagine faithful love. His image hardened into that of the dependable leading man, the one the industry held up as proof that a black male star could be both vulnerable and safe for the mainstream. But behind that polished image was a decision. At some point, he had chosen what kind of man he would appear to be in public, and in making that choice, he seemed to have decided there was no room in the story for the person who had helped shape his sound in the shadows. For Luther, this wasn't just another disappointment. It was, as one friend put it, a wound that never scabbed. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about a single night. It was about gratitude. How quickly it could disappear under the harsh light of cameras. How easily history could be edited to fit a narrative that sold better. A quiet year of closeness. One cold sentence on national television. And then a silence that lasted until the end of Luther's life. Some people called it survival. They said the younger man did what he had to do to protect his brand, to fit into an industry that didn't always tolerate complexity. But to Luther, if that rumored list truly existed, this man was not just another entry. He was the proof that sometimes the deepest betrayal doesn't come from enemies or rivals. It comes from someone whose voice you helped steady, who then uses that same voice to pretend you were never there. Some wounds, people said, don't even leave a mark on the skin. They live somewhere deeper, like a song you can't erase from the tape, no matter how many times you record over it. If the quiet list in Luther's mind really existed, the third man on it was different from the others. He wasn't a student. He wasn't a fragile pop comet trying to hang on to fame. He was already a god on stage. Long before Luther's name headlined arenas, he was just another voice in the shadows, an uncredited background singer hired to make other men sound richer, fuller, larger than life. One of those men was a towering soul icon, broad shoulders, chest hair on display, shirt open almost to the waist, a baritone so thick it made women scream and throw whatever they could rip off their bodies toward the stage. To the public, this man was the embodiment of straight desire. The real man, the fantasy. Behind the curtains, the story looked different. They first crossed paths at a label showcase in the late 1970 seconds. Luther had been brought in to lay background harmonies on a slow-burning ballad. He was supposed to stand behind the mic, sing his parts, and disappear. But in the control room, according to a technician who was there that night, something changed. The star was listening to the playback of an early take when he stopped and frowned, not in anger, but in surprise. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as Luther's voice slid through the speakers in stacked harmonies, wrapping around his own lead like smoke. He walked into the booth, held out his hand. "You sing like you've made love to every word," he reportedly told Luther. Luther laughed, shy and a little flustered. It was the first time anyone that powerful had spoken to him like that. After that, they didn't become inseparable. They didn't parade around as best friends, but they kept turning up in the same places. One night, Luther stood in the wings of a Texas venue and watched the star's entire show without moving, eyes locked on the stage. Another night in a southern city, the same star invited him to dinner. No managers, no entourage, just a quiet restaurant where the waiters pretended not to stare. No one knows exactly what was said over that meal. The only thing staff remembered was that when the car pulled up to the hotel hours later, both men stepped out of the same back seat. Someone claimed they saw Luther slip into his room only after sunrise. No one asked questions. By the end of that year, rumors had begun to hum under the surface of the industry. They weren't headlines, yet just whispers in dressing rooms and studio corridors. Two R&B men, often seen together. Two hotel keycards stacked on the same nightstand. A tiny entertainment column hinted at two famous soul voices, leaving a hotel room at dawn. No names were printed. They didn't have to be. In a small, tightly wound scene, people filled in the blanks themselves. Luther never spoke about it. He kept doing what he always did, showing up, singing, going home. But the star was different. His entire empire was built on one idea. Women adored him. Women wanted him. He was the symbol, The fantasy, the proof that a black man could be sold as pure, raw masculinity to every corner of America. Any hint of complication, any suggestion that his nights didn't match his image, was a threat, not just to his ego, but to his livelihood. So, when a reporter finally decided to say out loud what everyone else had only whispered, the room froze. It happened at a press conference in a New York hotel ballroom, bright lights glaring off polished microphones. The star sat at the front, smiling for photos, answering questions about his tour, his success, his image as the ultimate ladies' man. Then a hand went up in the back. A voice, a little too bold, cut through the noise. "Are the rumors true that you and another male singer have a closer relationship? People say you two spent the night together after shows." The air broke. According to one journalist who stood near the front row, the star didn't blush. He didn't hesitate. He threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, cutting sound that echoed off the ballroom walls. Then he leaned toward the mic and delivered the line that would, for some, define him forever. "I'm a real man," he said loudly. "I don't sing for no funny stuff." He didn't say Luther's name. He didn't have to. The room laughed with him, eager to align themselves with the safe side of the joke. Cameras flashed. Record executives nodded in relief. The message was clear. Whatever anyone thought they had seen in elevators or hallways or hotel lobbies, it meant nothing. Somewhere else in the city, Luther heard about it. A friend later recalled that when they repeated the quote to him, his face didn't twist in anger. It just seemed to collapse inward, like a building whose foundations had quietly given way. He wasn't devastated because someone was hinting at his private life. He was devastated because someone who had once whispered to him in the dark now needed to publicly pretend he was something dirty, something laughable, in order to keep his own image intact. The next day, Luther cut the cord. No more calls. No more sessions. No more hallway conversations that lasted too long. He erased the man's name from his day-to-day vocabulary, the way an engineer might mute a track on the mixing board, cleanly, completely, without explanation. And then, as if the universe had been holding its breath, everything changed again. One night in the early 82nds, the star got into a car in his hometown. The roads were slick. The night was damp and restless. At some point along a curving drive, the car lost control and hit hard, metal twisting into a shape no mechanic could fix. The news bulletins were immediate and relentless. A soul legend. A horrific crash. Spinal damage. Paralysis. The sex symbol who once prowled the stage, sweating in the heat of 1,000 desires, now sat in a wheelchair, facing a lifetime of motors, straps, and careful assisted movements. Some people, in the cruel way people talk when they're afraid of their own secrets, whispered the word karma. Others just shook their heads, stunned at how fast a body and a career could change course. The truth was more complicated. The accident wasn't a moral lesson. It was physics, timing, and fate. But for those who knew the history, it was impossible not to feel something tighten in their chest when they remembered that press conference, the mocking laughter, the loud declaration of being a real man, the rejection of anything that didn't fit the script. After the crash, the star tried to rebuild. He recorded albums from his chair, voice carrying more strain, more gravel, a different kind of sorrow. The posters changed. The stages changed. The crowds thinned but never disappeared entirely. He almost never mentioned the 1,970 seconds in detail. He avoided questions about that period, answered them with vague smiles and redirecting jokes. And as far as anyone can recall, he never spoke Luther's name in public again. Luther, for his part, stayed silent too. He didn't visit the hospital. He didn't send flowers. He didn't appear at benefit concerts or tribute nights centered around the fallen star. Years later, when the man released a new project meant to show a little more magic left in his life, someone brought the album up in the studio. Luther reportedly gave a small, sad smile and said quietly, "That's the last thing I ever wanted, to give him a little more magic." Then he looked away, as if the conversation itself was an intrusion. In the end, the star died with his legacy publicly intact. The once mighty sex symbol who had refused to surrender even after the chair, the accident, the endless work of learning how to live in a body that no longer obeyed him. Most write-ups never mentioned anything beyond the music, the fans, the tragedy, the triumph. But somewhere in the margins of another man's story, Luther's story, he remained something else. Not the great love, not the great enemy, the imagined lover, the man who once reached for his hand in private, and then threw that same hand into the shadow of ridicule when the microphones were on. If that secret list was real, this third name carried a different weight. It wasn't just about betrayal or cruelty. It was about shame, how far someone would go to outrun their own reflection, even if it meant pushing another person straight into the dark with them. And it raises a question that still lingers over their intertwined stories. In the end, was the harshest prison his wheelchair, or the fear that made him deny the one person who saw him without the costume? By the time you reach the fourth name on that whispered list, the pattern starts to look familiar. Trust given in the dark. Silence demanded in the daylight. But this one was different, because unlike Luther, this man never hid. In the era when disco lights burned like artificial suns over crowded dance floors, there was one figure who didn't just step into the beam, he lived there. He wore sequins like armor. He sang in heels and silk. He danced as if shame had never been invented. To the outside world, he was the fearless one, the flamboyant black singer who looked straight into the camera and dared America to either love him or look away. Critics called him outrageous. Fans called him a queen. The industry, afraid and fascinated at the same time, treated him like a beautiful fire they could not control. Luther was the opposite. Where the disco star shouted, Luther whispered. Where the other man announced himself, Luther folded into shadows and let the music do the talking. Still, in that contrast, something unspoken passed between them. They sang on the same festival bills once or twice, shared backstage corridors, brushed hands while trading microphones. There were stories always told quietly, always prefaced with, "This is just what I heard about a night in a hotel overlooking a neighborhood where rainbow flags hung from windows and laughter poured out of bars until sunrise." It was said that in that room, away from managers and photographers and the gossiping spine of the industry, they lay side by side and listened to rough demos that never made it to radio. Songs about wanting to be seen, not just adored. Songs about what it meant to be a black man in music who didn't fit the script. One of them had built a career on saying, "This is who I am." The other had built a fortress on never saying it at all. For a while, that difference didn't matter. They existed in those in-between spaces, after parties, when most people had gone home, early mornings when the world was too tired to judge. Then the 80 seconds arrived and the disco star's fire started to burn out. The clubs that once begged for his presence stopped calling. Labels, terrified of backlash and shifting trends, began dropping anything that smelled too openly queer, too risky, too loud. The same persona that once lit up magazine covers now showed up in boardrooms as a liability. Too much, people said. Too flamboyant. Too explicit. Too easy for conservative audiences to turn into a headline and a boycott. Shows were canceled. Record advances dried up. The IRS, indifferent to glitter or glory, reportedly came knocking with unpaid bills. In his worst moment, when the phone had stopped ringing and the spotlight had shifted to safer faces, it was said that he reached for the one person no one expected him to call, Luther. By then, Luther was riding a different kind of wave. His ballads dominated radio. His albums stabilized label balance sheets. He was the dependable one, the man executives trusted to deliver. At a time when he could have chosen any safe collaborator to keep the machine running smoothly, some insiders claimed that Luther quietly used his leverage for something else. A fourth album, a key track. One guessed he could have picked the rising names everyone already loved. He didn't. According to people who worked at the studio, Luther insisted on bringing the fading disco star back into the booth, not as a stunt, not as a joke, as a chance. It was rumored that he covered studio costs out of his own pocket, paid musicians in advance, pushed paperwork around behind the scenes so the other man's tax troubles wouldn't choke the project before it even began. No public announcement, no interviews about saving anyone, just a quiet, calculated act of mercy. In one session they worked on a ballad some said Luther had written specifically with this man in mind, a song tentatively titled with a single word, something like Grace. The track wasn't loud or flashy. It was fragile, designed like a confession between two souls who had seen too much. For a brief moment, it looked like a resurrection, a comeback without the circus. Then came the turn. Inside that studio, where the air should have been thick with music and second chances, the mood reportedly shifted. The disco star grew impatient. Being invited in wasn't enough. He wanted his face on the cover. He wanted his name on the producer line. He wanted half of the rights to a song he hadn't paid to build. When the label pushed back, trying to protect its investment and its carefully curated image, he didn't just argue. In front of engineers, assistants, and Luther himself, he was said to have thrown down an ultimatum. If he didn't get more, he would talk. Talk about hotel rooms where the curtain stayed closed until noon. About handwritten notes slipped under doors in cities both of them had almost forgotten. About nights when the man the world believed was made purely for women had let his guard down and rested his head beside someone who understood him in ways the industry never could. The room went silent. According to one person present, Luther's face didn't show anger, just a slow, flat disappointment, like someone watching a bridge they had spent years building crumble in a single second. He didn't shout. He didn't bargain. He simply stood up and walked out. The project was abandoned. The song disappeared from official archives, erased as cleanly as a line deleted from a script before opening night. The money vanished too. Tens of thousands of dollars poured into a collaboration turned to ashes. But the real damage wasn't in the wasted budget. It was in the realization that the one man he had risked his own position to help the one who had worn his identity with fearless pride would still reach for the oldest weapon in the industry: the threat of exposure. A few weeks later, another story began circulating through underground scenes. A bootleg track started popping up in certain clubs, an unfinished demo, chopped and twisted into a cruel remix. Snatches of a familiar voice floated over a beat, spliced with laughter and chopped phrases that made the whole thing sound less like a song and more like a joke aimed at someone who would never step onto that dance floor. DJs played it behind closed doors, like a secret handshake. Crowds yelled and laughed, some in recognition, some in ignorance. Luther, it was said, got hold of a copy. He didn't go public. He didn't sue. He didn't call in favors from lawyers or label executives. He went to his private space, took every tape, every rough mix, every scrap of handwritten lyrics connected to that man, and burned them. One note in particular was remembered by those who claimed to have seen it before it turned to ash. A simple line, left after one of their early nights together: "Thank you for not locking the door." After the fire, the door was locked. Luther canceled future plans involving that city. He turned down offers tied to that scene. He banned certain names from even being spoken in his sessions. When someone slipped and mentioned the disco star years later, Luther reportedly gave no rant, no monologue. He just said, "He taught me something expensive." By the late 82nds, illness began to shadow the other man. Weight dropped, bookings vanished. He moved into smaller rooms with thinner walls and fewer visitors. The same industry that once used his image as a spectacle now pretended not to remember his phone number. Before he died, a few people claimed he confessed something half regret, half confession. "There was someone once who was willing to pay my debts," he supposedly said. "All I had to do was sing. And I betrayed him." No one can prove the quote. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was wishful thinking from people who wanted to believe in last-minute remorse. What we do know is this: when the final service was held, filled with mourners in bright clothes and loud music in his honor, Luther was not in the room. No flowers, no statement, no tribute. On paper, their stories barely intersect. Different genres, different images, different endings. But if that secret list inside Luther's memory had a fourth name etched into it, this man was more than just a traitor. He was the proof that even among people who should have understood each other best, black men in a brutal industry, queer in ways the world could barely tolerate, the hunger for survival could still twist kindness into a weapon. Some debts, Luther learned, don't disappear when you pay them. They simply change hands. Sold again and again for a few more nights of applause. And it leaves one chilling question behind. If even the bravest person in the room is willing to trade your truth for leverage, who, in a world like that, could Luther ever truly trust? By the fifth name on that invisible list, the story had shifted. This time, it wasn't a singer. It wasn't a man fighting for chart positions or magazine covers. It was someone who lived in the dark, where Luther's secrets felt safest. In the mid-82nds, long before mainstream America truly understood the word house, there were clubs where the music never seemed to end. Warehouses with no windows, lights that cut through smoke like blades. Rooms full of sweat, shadows, and men who needed somewhere anywhere to exist without pretending. In that underground world, there was a legendary figure behind the decks. Not a frontman, but a gatekeeper. A DJ and remixer whose hands moved between vinyl and knobs like a surgeon, building nights from scratch. In Chicago, people spoke his name like a password. He wasn't a superstar on TV. He didn't care about award shows. But in the right circles, he was everything. He controlled which songs lived on dance floors and which ones died in dusty crates. According to those who moved in both worlds, he and Luther first crossed paths through a cassette. It arrived one day without fanfare, a homemade remix of one of Luther's most devastating ballads. No credit, no official request, just a note. If you listen to this at midnight, I think you'll understand. Luther, curious and cautious, slipped it into a player late one night. The familiar melody emerged, but twisted, slowed down, then built back up over a pulse that felt like a heartbeat pushed through a wall. His own voice floated above a new landscape, lonely and enormous. 2 weeks later, they met in New York at a private gathering of industry people, remixers, and quietly influential nobodies. The DJ wasn't what Luther expected. No wild costume, no dramatic presentation. Just a gray turtleneck, a calm face, and eyes that watched everything in the room like they were always 3 moves ahead. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost disarming. They talked off to the side, away from the main conversations. For once, no one was asking Luther for a photo or a favor. No one demanded he sing something just a little bit, right here. It was just 2 men discussing tempo, reverb, the way certain songs only came alive at 3 a.m. when everyone was too tired to lie to themselves. From that night on, they kept finding each other. Late-night walks through quiet neighborhoods after shows, where they could talk without being recognized. Studio sessions behind closed doors, where the DJ sat on the floor while Luther paced, working through melodies that might never see daylight. Cassette tapes passed between them like letters, snippets of unfinished tracks, fragments of confessions disguised as vocals and beats. No one in Luther's official camp ever called it love, but some of them noticed the change. This was the one person Luther seemed to trust enough to let into rooms where he didn't wear his usual armor, rooms where he wasn't the star, the carefully constructed product. One winter, during a secret show in Chicago, their connection deepened. Luther checked into a quiet hotel under a discreet name. No entourage, no cameras. After the performance, instead of joining the usual industry crowd, he slipped away with the DJ to a club that wasn't on any tourist map, a place where the music was so loud it blurred the edges of everything else. Later that night, they went back to the hotel. No assistants, no bodyguards. Just a bottle of red wine, 2 glasses, and a tape recorder set on a dresser, not for work, but for the kind of intimacy only someone like Luther could offer, a voice in its rawest form. In that room, it was said, he sang one of his favorite songs, a cappella, just for the 2 of them. No mic, no effects, just air, lungs, and truth. He thought the recorder would hold only the music, but the DJ, who lived for capturing sound, knew something else. The most powerful part of the night wasn't the song. It was the silence between them. According to people who later heard the whispers, the real betrayal began not that night, but the next time Luther came back to Chicago. He arrived under the same cloak of secrecy, hood up, glasses on, slipping through back doors and service hallways to avoid being noticed. This time, the DJ invited him into a private booth above the club, a small room filled with wires, records, and the soft glow of equipment lights. Up there, above a crowd that danced in the dark below, Luther let his guard down. He talked about things he rarely put into words. His fear that if people really knew him, everything he had built would collapse. The men who had come and gone, the ones who loved him only as long as no one else was watching, the kind of loneliness that didn't vanish when the applause started, it just learned how to hide inside the melodies. He didn't know that under the soundboard something else was already rolling. A recorder. Not because the DJ wanted to blackmail him, that was the excuse he would give later to himself and anyone who questioned him. "This is art," he reportedly said. "Honest art." He captured every cracked sentence, every tremor in Luther's voice when he talked about never really being able to live as himself. A few weeks later, at a party in another Chicago warehouse, a new track began to circulate. It started with a slow build, the kind of house groove the DJ was known for. The crowd swayed, waiting for the drop. Then, over the speakers, a voice cut through. A familiar voice. "I've never really been myself. If people knew who I am, I'd lose everything." Laughter rippled through the room. Not everyone recognized it, but some did. They didn't need a name. They knew that tone, that ache, that particular way of stretching a word until it almost broke. The confessions kept looping, chopped and rearranged over the beat, turned into hooks and punchlines. What Luther had believed was the safest thing he'd ever given another man. His unguarded truth had been sliced up and turned into a spectacle for people who would never know the cost behind those words. When a copy of that track made its way back to Luther, delivered by someone who didn't know how else to warn him, he didn't shout. He didn't storm into offices. He didn't publicly denounce anyone. Instead, he went very, very quiet. In private, people said he pulled out every tape, every mix, every scrap of sound connected to that DJ, the raw a cappella recording, the late-night experiments, even the little handwritten note that had once felt like a keepsake. "Thanks for not locking the door." One by one, he destroyed them. Not as a dramatic gesture, as a funeral. He canceled shows in that city for years. Turned down offers from producers and remixers associated with that scene. If someone, not knowing the history, tried to bring up the DJ's name in a meeting, Luther didn't raise his voice. He simply replied, "Turn it off." The DJ, according to people who followed his career, didn't exactly apologize. He told the story in interviews and workshops like a parable about authenticity, about a famous singer who couldn't live his truth, whose secrets had inspired a very real piece of music. He never said Luther's name out loud, but the sample said enough. For Luther, if that list in his mind was real, this fifth man wasn't just another disappointment. He was the proof that even within the very community where he should have been safest, even among men who knew exactly what it meant to hide and hurt his most fragile confessions, could still be turned into entertainment. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft. He thought he had found intimacy. What he really found was pre-production. The arms that held him had also reached down at the quietest moment to press record. And it left a mark that no one could see from the outside. From that night on, Luther's circle grew smaller. The doors he left unlocked became fewer. Because once someone turns your deepest fear into a beat for strangers to dance to, how do you ever trust another man with your silence again? By the time you reach the sixth name on that hidden list, the pattern is brutal and clear. Some men hurt Luther with jokes, some with denial, some with leverage. But this last one had something the others didn't: power. Not just the power to fill theaters or sell records. The power to shape narratives, to erase people, to make a scandal disappear with a phone call and a signed document. He wasn't a singer. He didn't live in the studio. He lived in front of cameras. A top-tier black entertainer, known first for his stand-up that cut through polite society like a razor, then for movie roles that turned him into a household name. By the late 80s, his face was everywhere. Posters, talk shows, magazine covers. He and Luther were first seen in the same frame backstage at an awards show, a night dripping with sequins, gold statues, and carefully rehearsed smiles. The comedian had just conquered the world with a raw, blistering special. Luther was there on the strength of an album that had turned him into the definitive voice of romantic soul. They weren't billed together. They didn't perform side by side. But in the corridors, away from the cameras, people noticed something quiet. A shared joke near the catering table, a hand on a shoulder held half a second too long, Two men who had nothing to prove suddenly speaking to each other in low tones while the rest of the room buzzed around them. Over the next few years, their paths continued to cross. Private birthday parties in gated homes, late-night studio visits under the pretense of just hanging out, rooms where jokes faded and the energy shifted into something calmer, more dangerous. From the outside, they were just two famous black men at the top of their respective worlds. On the inside, some people said there was more. According to whispers in certain New York circles, from the late 80 seconds into the early 90 seconds, Luther sometimes carried cassettes that no one else was allowed to label or copy. They weren't demos or radio edits. They were voice messages. A familiar laugh. A confession spoken just above a whisper. A man who could make millions roar in crowded theaters, talking very differently when no one else was supposed to be listening. No one stamped a name on those tapes. No one needed to. If that secret list in Luther's mind had a sixth entry, it was believed this man's name was written in heavy ink. And then, one night, everything shattered. In the late 90 seconds, while the comedian's fame was still towering, police in Los Angeles pulled over his car in the early hours of the morning. Reports quickly surfaced that he wasn't alone. His passenger, according to official records, was a transgender woman who had appeared in police files before for sex work. He was not arrested, but the headlines didn't care about legal nuance. They cared about spectacle. Within hours, his name was everywhere. Television hosts smirked through monologues, tabloids printed grainy photos. The public, always hungry for a scandal, circled like sharks around the idea that their favorite ladies' man might not be as simple as his role suggested. The comedian denied everything that hinted at more than bad luck and a good deed. He cast himself as a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But according to people close to the Hollywood machine, the real panic happened off-camera. Studio deals were at stake. Family-friendly images were on the line. Endorsements and future projects suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. Within days, it was said that his legal and PR team began building a private document, not for the public, but for risk control. A list of names. People from his past who might, under enough pressure or for enough money, tell stories that would inflame the fire instead of putting it out. Somewhere in that document, according to a source in the Beverly Hills management world, one name was highlighted as high risk: Luther Vandross. What followed, if the rumors are to be believed, was not a phone call, not a visit, but paperwork. On a quiet day, not long after the scandal broke, a group of legal representatives reportedly appeared at Luther's door. They weren't there to ask how he was. They were there with a thick envelope and a clear message: sign. Inside, it was said there was an agreement dense, clinical language that boiled down to one demand. Luther would never speak, write, hint, or even artistically imply anything about whatever had existed between him and the comedian. No interviews. No memoir chapters. No lyrics that could be traced back. Nothing. For Luther, who had spent his entire life being careful, hiding, dodging questions, this wasn't just another request for silence. It was a weapon pointed at the one thing he had left control over: his own story. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't leak the document. But insiders said something in him shifted. Within 10 days, a string of summer tour dates that had already been announced under his then-current label simply vanished from schedules. No clear explanation, no replacement dates. Some people inside the camp believed Luther refused to keep moving as if nothing had happened. He had watched his private world, once again, turned into a calculation by someone who stood to lose far more in public than he did, and so they tried to make sure he carried that fear for both of them. Meanwhile, the comedian got to work remaking himself. By the end of that decade, he appeared in carefully chosen interviews about the pressures of fame, about the difficulty of being misunderstood in the public eye. His team crafted narratives that focused on hustle, legacy, and family, while avoiding the one incident that had triggered the quiet purge behind the scenes. Hollywood forgave him, or at least it moved on. He landed roles that made children laugh, voiced beloved animated characters. Later, he even earned awards recognition for dramatic work. His career bent, but did not break. Luther's path was different. From the late 90 seconds into the early 2000s, his presence dimmed. The big tours became rarer. Interviews grew scarce. He seemed to retreat into smaller rooms, intimate shows, tightly controlled appearances, moments when he could still be Luther the performer without having to risk being Luther the man. He did deliver one last great wave, an album that would become his final fully promoted triumph. It was filled with songs about family, memory, and the ache of wanting to hold on to what time always tries to take away. Not long after, his body began to falter. A stroke. Hospital rooms. Machines humming steadily beside his bed, while friends, colleagues, and admirers sent flowers and messages. Many came to visit. Many called. According to those who were there, the comedian was not among them. No surprise appearance at the hospital. No public tribute. No quiet note sent through a mutual friend. When Luther finally passed, there were statements from singers, producers, actors, presidents, and fans. Tributes poured in about his talent, his influence, the way his songs had etched themselves into people's lives. From the man whose name was once allegedly circled in red on a private risk list, there was only silence. No one outside their circles knew what had ever existed between them. No one outside that inner world knew what had been demanded of Luther in the name of protection. The official story, the one that lived in documentaries and magazine retrospectives, spoke about his voice, his struggles with weight, his perfectionism, his health battles. It did not speak about the day a piece of paper arrived at his door, effectively telling him that, once again, his truth was too dangerous to live anywhere but inside his own head. If that secret list in Luther's mind really did exist, this sixth man may have been the one who cut deepest, not because of a single cruel sentence or a mocking joke, but because of the quiet, suffocating message buried in legal language and Hollywood fear. You are not allowed to exist in my story, even if I exist in yours. In the end, the question that hangs over all six names is not just who hurt him the most. Was it the first man who turned tenderness into a punchline? The protégé who pretended their bond was nothing more than fandom? The imagined lover who laughed away their nights together to prove his own manhood? The fallen star who tried to weaponize shared secrets for one more shot at control? The DJ who pressed record when he should have offered protection? Or the powerful comedian who erased an entire chapter with a single envelope? Maybe the real answer is harsher. Maybe the deepest wound wasn't any one man at all, but the system that taught them all to be terrified of loving someone like Luther Vandross in the first place. A world where black male icons were allowed to sing about love, joke about love, act out love on screen, as long as it was a very specific kind of love. We can list the names. We can trace the nights, the rumors, the silences. But somewhere, beneath all of that, lies a final unanswered question. If Luther had lived in a time and an industry where he could have stood in the light exactly as he was, would any